All right, U.S. history. This is Chapter 2, Revolution and the Early Republic. This is a review chapter, so we're going to go through it quickly. It's building off of your Revolutions unit from Modern World History, which was your history class last year. But before we get started, I want to look at the learning goals for this chapter. The first is to analyze the causes of the American Revolution, and that's going to be the goal that we focus on for this presentation. But the other two learning goals that you have for the chapter is to identify important events during the war and to trace the development of the American Republic. But again, we're focusing on learning goal 1, the causes of the revolution. So the colonial resistance to the British Empire begins with the Proclamation of 1763, which was issued by the English Parliament. It was an imaginary line that ran along the geographic feature of the Appalachian Mountains, and it basically prevented the colonists from moving further west to settle past those mountains. The English government felt like if the colonists settled further west of the Appalachians, that they wouldn't be able to ensure their safety. But this is one of the causes because American colonists were very opposed to the Proclamation of 1763. Another issue or a cause were the taxes that the British government were imposing on the colonists. And the reason for these taxes was to make up for some of the war debt from the French and Indian War. And the first one was the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. And the colonists protested because they felt like they didn't have a voice in the government, that these taxes were being imposed on them, and that they had no representation or no say in the English government. So looking at the Sugar Act, it placed taxes on certain imported items, and if colonists were accused of violating this act or smuggling in sugar or things that were associated with the Sugar Act, they could be tried in a vice admiral court rather than colonial courts. So they're not being tried by their peers. This is another cause leading to the American Revolution, the various taxes that were imposed on the colonists. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765. This act imposed a direct tax on printed documents. So the colonists would purchase their document and then, in addition, purchase the stamp to prove that they had paid the tax. Again, it's an example of a direct tax. So because of the taxes and the proclamation of 1763, you have a strong resistance movement that grows within the colonies. And in May of 1765, a secret group known as the Sons of Liberty are formed to protest these laws. And in addition, merchants in the colonies agreed to boycott any British goods. And that means that they were going to not purchase any British items that were imported into the colonies until those acts were repealed or taken away. Some of them were repealed, but once they were repealed, the English Parliament passed additional taxes. So with the repeal of the Stamp Act, you then have the passing of the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts, again, taxed items being imported into the colonies from England, and one of these major items was tea. Boston, Massachusetts had a lot of tension between protesters against the taxes and English military, and the city erupts in a clash between the tax protesters and the British soldiers, which results in what is known as the Boston Massacre, when a mob of protesters begin taunting the British soldiers. A shot is fired, which leads to additional shooting, and 5 colonists were killed. You can see that this was published and printed so that all the colonists could see. It was called the Boston Massacre, and it was used as propaganda to get colonists to resist or rebel against the British Empire. So again, the Boston Massacre could be considered a cause leading to the Revolutionary War. In addition, in Boston, you have the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which is a result of the Townshend Acts. So colonists in protest dump 18,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. And as a result of that, Parliament and King George then closed the Boston Harbor. So nothing can come in or out of that harbor. And in addition to closing the harbor, the English Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts were a series of different laws, including the Quartering Act, which basically meant that the colonists had to house and feed British soldiers in the colonies. All of these causes are leading to the American Revolution, and colonists start to organize and communicate with one another, and they send delegates to the First Continental Congress in 1774. And in that Continental Congress, they begin making preparations for a military, and England then reacts quickly by trying to seize the weapons that the colonists are stockpiling. The British soldiers tried to seize some stockpile of weapons at Lexington, and this leads to Paul Revere's famed midnight ride, where he is signaling that the British are coming. The first battle of the Revolution, or the first shots, were at Lexington and Concord. The battle itself only lasted 15 minutes, but it's the shot heard around the world, and the impact has lasted for over 200 years. Soon after, delegates are sent again. It's known as the Second Continental Congress. They meet in May of 1775. Some of the delegates are calling for independence, so completely breaking away from the British Empire, and others who are loyal to the British Empire, known as loyalists, they were fighting for reconciliation. They wanted to find a way or a compromise to end all of this tension and go back to being a part of the British Empire. Finally, Congress agreed to appoint George Washington as head of the Continental Army. In June 1775, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is near Boston. The colonists, or the patriots, were able to secure a surplus of ammunition and a high vantage point on Breed's Hill. So they were able to wipe out a lot of the redcoats, or the British soldiers, because of their high vantage point on the hill. But eventually, their surplus of ammo ran out and they were forced to retreat. Here's a map showing the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17th, 1775. By July of 1775, the Second Continental Congress was hoping that there could be some sort of peace. And again, a lot of the delegates were still loyal to the English crown, and they wanted to extend peace through an olive branch petition. And the king refused this olive branch petition, so basically continuing the revolution. The independence-minded colonists, they wanted a way to show their independence. They're inspired by the Enlightenment philosophies and ideas, and the philosophers like John Locke with his social contract and his natural rights. And then Thomas Paine was known for his series of pamphlets known as Common Sense, which basically gave the colonists the reasons why it was okay for them to rebel against the English Empire. The Declaration of Independence was issued on July 4th, 1776. It basically stated that the colonies were free and they declared their independence. Now they're going to have to fight against the British military in order to secure that independence. Here is the Declaration of Independence. And we will stop here until the next presentation.